Just 1 year ago, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, approved a resolution denying Jewish ties to the Temple Mount. Quote, UNESCO can vote on anything they wish, but this is to the shame of that institution. If it would be in their interest to declare that the earth is flat, they would have a majority vote. According to Barkai, Temple Mount denial is a recent political phenomenon that began in the 1990s during the period of the Oslo Accords. The whole change came when a very naive Bill Clinton wanted to solve all the problems of the world, and someone whispered into his ear that the Temple Mount is the crux of the Middle East conflict. He wanted to solve the conflict by solving the problem of sovereignty on the Temple Mount. At that time, the Muslim historic narrative about Jerusalem radically changed. Newfound claims that Jerusalem was in fact the capital of the Palestinians, even though there was never mention of Arab sovereignty in any of their ancient texts. The whole thing is a political matter and misuse of ancient history for current political purposes. Christian identity and replacement theology groups have gone a step further and recently proposed a scenario in which the Temple Mount was never the location of the temple, but was instead a multi-billion-dollar platform built by Herod to serve as camp and parade ground for occupying Roman troops. Those who denied the authenticity of the Temple Mount, both Muslim and Christian, completely disregard the Temple Mount survey conducted by the man considered to be the father of biblical archaeology, Conrad Schick.
In 1872, a German engineer and Christian missionary to the Jews, Conrad Schick, who is now considered to be the father of biblical archaeology, he was the one that performed the only authorized excavations of the Temple Mount. Schick's explorations measured and documented the multi-million-gallon cisterns under the plaza platform that were fed from the Bethesda pool 200 meters north of the Temple Mount and from Solomon's pools, which are more than 10 miles away from the Temple Mount. Schick's subterranean survey that he performed under the jurisdiction and funding of the Ottoman Turks who ruled Jerusalem at that time, the Muslim Authority also sanctioned the construction of a 200-to-1 scale model of the subterranean structures that are underneath the mosque, which now dominate the Temple Mount. Schick's model was then exhibited at the Ottoman Empire Pavillion at the 1873 World's Fair in Vienna. And then, after more than 130 years in exile, the model returned to Jerusalem for study. The day before it was returned, I flew into Israel. I went to Jerusalem, and I was able to photograph and take apart this model for the first time in more than 130 years. Removing the multiple layers of the model reveals the multi-billion-dollar substructure upon which the temples of Solomon, Zerubbabel, and Herod were built. They estimated it would cost more than $2 billion just to build the substructure upon which the temples were built. Most importantly, Conrad Schick's model revealed a manufactured capstone on the peak of the previously hidden mountain. The capstone was an integral part of the sand hydraulic elevator that opened to the passageway through which Jeremiah and the priests transported the Ark of the Covenant into the caves of Mount Moriah.
We are going to discuss the water problem that has now been transpiring in the land of Israel. This last year, starting with last spring, there's been no rain. A half year later, we're walking along the Sea of Galilee on the beach, looking up above our heads, 15 feet above, where boats were coming in last year. This is our fresh drinking water. There's no water in the land of Israel to drink. But yet, while all of this dearth is going on, then we see up on the Temple Mount, there are 4 cisterns up on the Temple Mount. These 4 cisterns are hewn out of solid rock, and at one time had water diverted in them so that we could bring the water out for use in the temple service. But this year, when everything is dying of thirst, on top of this solid rock, there is water gushing into those 4 solid rock cisterns from who knows where. No one could explain it. The Arabs panicked. They thought that something was happening and undermining the foundation of the Dome of the Rock. And so they began pumping out water day after day. Every morning after the Muslim hours of prayer, they set up an apparatus in each one of these, and they began pumping out the water out of these cisterns. Then they also took up the covering stones from the Temple Mount up there, and what happened is that they exposed the southern wall of the foundation of Solomon's temple. We knew where the northern foundation was. Now with the southern foundation exposed, then we knew that underneath this Dome of the Spirits, which is here in the background, this Dome of the Spirits, which the Arabs are very touchy about, there is a huge rock underneath that. The Arabs do not want anyone even standing on that rock. And yet we know now that that rock is part of the sand hydraulic elevator system, and it's part of the elevator that Solomon built in the temple in order to hide the Ark of the Covenant in the case of a siege of Jerusalem. We now know that that large stone underneath the Dome of the Spirits, which the Arabs are very touchy about, is in the middle of the Holy of Holies of Solomon's temple. He said that if anyone goes in there, the Arabs are very touchy about it and won't allow anyone to go in there. In fact, they have traditions in which people have walked in there and they've died. That's their legends. So I got up early the next morning and I walked right in there and stood right in the middle of that stone. And to the left, there are several buildings there, and immediately an Arab came out and was yelling at me, "Get out of there! Get out of there!" And I stood in there and said, "Who, me?" And I looked around like I'm completely innocent and have no idea what's going on. And he ran out there and came all the way around to the north side, the south side, excuse me, and motioned, "Come out, come out." And I said, "Why? What is this? Come out, come out." He wouldn't speak to me. I had to come out. So I stepped out and I said, "Well, what is this?" And he said, "You can read about it." And I said, "Where?" I thought he was going to give me a brochure. And he said, "In books, now leave." Very abrupt with me, so I left and I circled back around, and of course you can see 2 of the other cistern heads there as they're assembling the pumps there. Now what I did is I took a bottle and I got some water just before I left the Temple Mount, got some water that was being pumped out of these cisterns, put a cap on it, walked across the Temple Mount, and then I heard several Arabs yelling at me, "Stop! Stop!" And of course I don't understand English at all, so I started moving a little bit quicker, got down the western steps where I was surrounded by about 20 Arabs, and there it was that I saw the Israeli guard coming with the M16s and the grenade launchers, and as they approached, then this big Arab said, they were very troubled. They saw me pacing all this out, measuring stuff out, and then I got this water, very upset about it, and then the big guy said, "Are you Jewish?" And I said, "I'm an American." And he said, "Are you Jewish?" I said, "I'm an American and I believe in Jesus." And then he really got hostile, and they said, "I believe in Jesus. Everyone believes in Jesus. Are you Jewish?" And right then, the Israelis saw that I'm dragging this out as long as I can. They grab me by the shoulders, take me to the police station, and after 2 hours, there with the bottle of water in the background, with a little bit of a smile on their face, they finally say, "I've done nothing wrong in Israel, and I'm free to go." And so I brought my water back to the United States. Now, I want to take you to the Temple of Solomon, because this is what Solomon built to house the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark sat in that location. The Dome of the Spirits sits right over the stone that sat in the Holy of Holies, and I want to take you there to see this. This is the, as you look at the base of this, you will see the stone upon which the Dome of the Spirits is sitting. It's not attached to it. And you see the pillars, the columns there, and now I want to take you to a representation of that. You see the dome of the spirits? I'm going to take away the dome, and you see the 8 pillars. Take away the pillars, and so you see the foundation stone. Take away the foundation, and there you have a square stone with 4 keyways that would secure it into place. That is what was in Solomon's temple, dead center in Solomon's temple, in the Holy of Holies. And this is its position in relationship to the foundation stones that have been uncovered on the Temple Mount. Now, to understand this, as the scripture says, this is before the foundation of Solomon's temple began. It says Solomon made affinity with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. The word affinity in the Hebrew indicates a secret agreement that has to be kept in the family, so it requires marriage to keep it within the family secrets. That's why Solomon took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had made an end of building his own house and the house of the Lord. Every time it mentions his marriage to Pharaoh's daughter, it speaks of it in relationship to building the temple. It's a very important key, because this affinity that he made with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, is important in that the only machine that was known in that day was the lever. And the Egyptians were masters with building with levers and sand hydraulic technology, and that is why Pharaoh made a deal with Solomon, and Solomon married into the family secrets of the house of Egypt. Now, the tabernacle in the wilderness was 30 cubits by 10 cubits, the Holy of Holies being 10 cubits by 10 cubits. Whereas the temple was 60 cubits by 20 cubits. Solomon made it much larger, 4 times larger than the tabernacle in the wilderness. Why? It's because of what he was building. He was building a machine to hide the Ark of the Covenant. And King Solomon sent and fetched Hiram out of Tyre, a worker in brass, filled with wisdom and understanding, cunning to work all works of brass. Now, Hiram out of Tyre is referred to by the Masons as Hiram Abiff. And they, in their teachings, relate that Hiram Abiff was the first Mason, and he was the one that built Solomon's temple and understood the secrets of Solomon's temple. And so that's why when you go into Masonic temples, that the sky or the ceiling is black with stars painted, indicating they did their work at night, and it was all secret work. Tonight, you are going to see things and understand things that no 33rd degree Mason has even imagined. And I know, I've been in one of the largest Masonic temples in the world just a few weeks ago, because I told them I got back from Israel, and we now understand some things about the temple, and I wanted to discuss it with them, because there's something very interesting in every Masonic temple, and we'll talk about it right here. Because Hiram cast 2 pillars of brass, 18 cubits high apiece, a line of 12 cubits did compass them, and he made 2 capitals. Chapiters are capitals of molten brass to sit on top of the pillars. Now, these pillars, if we were to have 5 people in a circle join hands and stretch themselves out, that's how big around these pillars were. They went up 31 feet tall, and on top of that, a capital of brass was made for it. The capitals were 5 cubits tall, the scriptures say. 5 cubits, very important, and the scriptures spend about 4 chapters speaking about these pillars and these capitals in different places in the Bible. Very Here are these pillars. The pillars are 30.93 feet tall, a telephone pole and a half tall, 6.5 feet in diameter, and they are 5 inches, about that, or a handbreadth, in thickness. So they're hollow, and they're made of brass, cast by Hiram out of Tyre. The capitals are 8.6 feet tall, made of solid brass, 6.5 feet in diameter, hundreds and hundreds of tons, and they have to sit on top of a hollow column, a telephone pole and a half tall, out in front of the temple. Very important. Solomon set up the pillars, and he set up the right pillar and called the name JACHIN, which means in Hebrew base or fulcrum. And he set up the left pillar and called it BOAZ, which means force. Solomon is describing the 2 sides of a lever, force and the base or the fulcrum on which it pivots by these 2 columns. In every Masonic temple that you go into in the world, I am told, there are two pillars. And they sit on each side of the speaker, and they have a B and a J on it. They represent these two columns. And being up there in Oklahoma, after speaking with him for about a half hour, I was taken in the back room, and he said the whole concept that we go back to Hiram in the building of the temple is really kind of a philosophic ideal. He says, what you're talking about, we have no idea what you're talking about and how these things work, because I began describing how these are machines, a lever machine in the temple, and so they had to admit they knew nothing about it, and they sent me over to the state headquarters and allowed me to go through their books, and there is where I found a representation of some of these columns. And now you're going to understand the rest of the story, because here is where those columns stand, out in front of the temple, and they support nothing. There they are in relationship to the rest of the articles of the furniture, and as we see, the Ark of the Covenant is not yet in here as I'm showing it on this particular slide. And then it says, at the time that the temple was dedicated, they brought the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord into his place, and they drew out these staves, that the end of the staves were seen out in the holy place before the oracle, and they were not seen without. And there they are to this very day. The Ark of the Covenant sat completely in front of this stone. The staves were completely pulled out to one end. Why? Because this whole stone is a room, an elevator room that's operated by sand hydraulics and a lever system that Solomon built in the temple. And now you're going to see how this works. Because when the dedication of the temple occurred, the glory of the Lord filled the house, and this spoke Solomon these two sentences after 7 years of building. The Lord said that he would dwell, it says in English, but Hebrew, it's a very unusual word. It's shakan, which means an established place to inhabit, and he would shakan in thick darkness, which is arafel, which means to be obscured from the sight of men. I, Solomon, have surely built thee, Yahweh, a house to dwell in, and there the word dwell is zabul, which means an exalted residence, and a settled place, makawan, a fixed place for thee to abide forever. Solomon was giving us a riddle that not only had he built an exalted residence, but he had built another place for the ark to remain forever. And the word forever in Hebrew means an extremely long time. Not necessarily for all of eternity, obviously. 500 years later, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came. He and his army pitched against Jerusalem, and he built a siege wall all the way around Jerusalem. And from that siege wall, Nebuzaradan, the captain, launched with these huge siege engines, these huge rocks, boulders, and busted down the walls of the city of Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan then, when the breach was made, and when they took it, and they defeated the soldiers, Nebuzaradan and his troops went up onto the Temple Mount and walked into the holy place, because they were after the greatest archaeological treasure, the most wonderful treasure in the entire world, the Ark of the Covenant. When they walked into the temple, what did Nebuzaradan find in the holy place? Nothing. There was nothing there. It says that he burnt the house of the Lord, the king's houses, all the houses of Jerusalem, completely ransacked and destroyed the whole city. What was he searching for? He was searching for the Ark of the Covenant, but he couldn't find it. What did he find? It says the shovels, the snuffers, the spoons, the fire pans, the bowls, all the vessels of brass the Chaldeans took away. And the two pillars Solomon made for the house of the Lord, the height of 18 cubits, the brass capital on top of it, the height of the brass capital was 3 cubits. Wait, I thought that capital sitting on top of that pillar, 31 feet high, was 5 cubits. What happened to 41.25 inches of solid brass weighing several tons sitting on top of a 31-foot column? When he got into the temple, all that was there was brass. Where was the table of showbread? Where was the golden lampstand? Where was the golden altar of incense? And where was the golden Ark of the Covenant? It wasn't there. Everything that was taken into Babylon was carefully detailed. And even Belshazzar was having a party and drinking out of the vessels of the temple, wasn't he? But yet, 70 years later, when they came back, everything was brought back. Not one thing was left in Babylon, but what never went and what never came back? The Ark of the Covenant. How did the rest of this brass, though? What happened to 41.25 inches of brass? Watch what happens. You're watching this pillar and this capital as it now sinks into this hollow column. It travels 41.25 inches. And it is operating a lever system underneath the temple to hide the Ark of the Covenant. It starts out 5 cubits, it ends up 3 cubits, to when Nebuzaradan goes in, it ends up 3 cubits. Watch how this operates. This is the temple, this is what it looks like from the bird's eye view. This is what it looks like from the side. You have on your far right, you have the column and you have the capital. The capital is the force that is applied to the end of the lever. But this is a reverse lever system. Usually we use a lever to help us to lift something very heavy on one end, and we put a fulcrum very near that heavy object and a long lever. Then we move the end of that long lever a great distance to lift a very heavy object just a short distance. This is a reverse lever system. Now it says in 2 Maccabees chapter 2 verses 2 and following that Jeremiah and several of the faithful priests being warned of the Lord in a vision. Now why I'm quoting Maccabees is Maccabees doesn't pretend to be scripture, even though it was in the original 1611 King James Version of the Bible, but it was removed many years later. It doesn't pretend to be scripture, but it is quoting from an earlier scroll in the handwriting of Baruch, the scribe of Jeremiah, which indicates that Jeremiah and the priest at the time of Nebuzaradan's siege received a vision so that they would know how to hide the Ark of the Covenant. Because it had been 500 years since it had been built, and no one knew how to operate the system. And so what happened is that by revelation they went up, and then at the bases of these columns, they with sledges would beat the bases in, allowing the sand to escape, and the full weight of the capitals come down on the lever ends. Then they would go into the Holy of Holies, and after covering the ark, would stand on the 4 lock stones, disengaging so that the entire elevator system can now begin its upward progression. From the side we see that now the weight of the capital, forcing down, the elevator unlocked, the sand of the damper causing the piston to go up, and now the elevator begins its upward motion. After the event, you can see, as you continue watching the monitor, that the capital is going to press down into place a stone that would be the same size as all the other stones up on the Temple Mount. So after the destruction of the temple, you could not tell that anything had transpired from the outside.
Baruch tells us that Yehovah commanded Jeremiah to take charge of the priests to perform one of the bravest exploits in the history of Israel. Dead priests were littering the Temple Mount. The troops of Nebuzaradan were breaching the wall into the temple courtyard, and Jeremiah shouted over the cacophony of war, "Priests and warriors of Yehovah, strike the pillars! Echad, Staim, Shalosh!" Years earlier, Solomon had equipped the temple with a sand hydraulic elevator that would be used to hide the Ark of the Covenant in the time of war.
Then, taking the Ark of the Covenant, which represents all the articles of gold, into the elevator system, then operating a second sand trap, then would allow the sand to escape and for the entire elevator room to then seat down into the subterranean passage under the temple. Then all the lock stones would then again lock down into place. The Ark of the Covenant would be taken into the subterranean passage, and when the temple was destroyed, there would be no evidence that anything has transpired. Now, just as the Lord said he would dwell, Shekinah in thick darkness, I, Solomon, built thee a house to dwell in, an exalted residence, and a place to abide forever. The Ark of the Covenant and the other articles left the temple by Jeremiah and were hidden away in the cave. And as Jeremiah heard that one of the priests began to mark out the way to the ark, when Jeremiah heard it, he rebuked the priest and said, the ark must remain in this secret place until the Lord God brings it forth in the last days, and his glory will be seen above the mercy seat as it was in the days of Moses and as it was in the days of Solomon. So, in Solomon's quarries under the city wall of Jerusalem, that is where Jeremiah found the stone case that Solomon had put there 500 years before. And he took the Ark of the Covenant and hid it and put it in that stone case that Solomon had prepared for a place for the Ark to remain forever. And then, on the way in, one of the priests began marking out the way, and in the 1800s, a French explorer found a half-carved cherub in this cave system. He chiseled it off the wall. It's sitting in the British Royal Museum to this very day. The only thing that remains of it is this steel marker down there that speaks of the guarding cherub that was chiseled off the wall. That's the last marker on how to find the Ark of the Covenant. Now this becomes very important because from that place where the stone is in the middle of the temple, you take a straight line right dead center through the middle of Solomon's quarries, and it takes us to where the stone case was buried outside the north wall of the city of Jerusalem. First prepared by Solomon, then the ark was put in there by Jeremiah at the siege of Nebuzaradan with the Babylonian Empire. And the pillars of brass, the Chaldeans broke them, the brazen sea, and carried all the brass to Babylon. And it described everything, including the capital of brass, but the capital of brass was 5 cubits tall. Why is it 5 cubits now? Because when Nebuzaradan came into the temple, the machine had been operated. All they could see when they burned the temple was the 18-cubit pillars and the 3 cubits of capitals on top. But when they broke them in pieces, they saw that the capitals are still 5 cubits tall. And they took them away into Babylon. All the secrets were there. And just as Solomon said, it is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but it is the glory of kings and the king's kids to search them out. That's why no 33rd degree Mason knows what the king's kids know at this point.